Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Please have a seat. There are more folks coming in, but we'll make room for them as they enter. Erev Tov, good evening. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to Stephen Wise Temple. And it's also a real kavod, a real honor to be able to host this evening with our partners at the ADL and at IPF. It's a terribly important conversation that we're going to have this evening, and I hope it will be the first of many collaborations that we'll have around these topics. It's fitting always to begin with a word of Torah. We're in the season of counting, what's known as Sfirat HaOmer. We count from Passover to Shavuot, 7 weeks, 49 days, and on the 50th, we celebrate the festival of our receiving Torah. It's a counting from the redemption that we experienced at the Sea of Reeds to the purpose of that redemption, Torah, a life of values, compassion, a life of tikkun, of repair and healing. And this tradition of counting connects to one of the Psalms, Psalm 90. It teaches, Limnot Yamenu Kein Hoda V'navi Levav Chochma. Teach us, says the psalmist, to count our days, that we may obtain a heart of wisdom. And here's the secret. It's not about counting how many days there are. It's about making the days we have count. It's about filling the time allotted to us with meaning and with purpose. And the conversation that we're going to have this evening about what it means to be part of a people, about our shared history and our shared destiny, about what divides us and what unites us, is a conversation about our very identity, about who we are and who we wish to become. And it's precisely this kind of conversation that brings meaning to our lives, that makes our days count, our time on this earth matter. So let's do it right. Let's do it well with respect and with compassion, so that we'll be graced with levav chokhmah, with hearts of wisdom. It's an honor to invite Ed Robin, a member of the IPF Board of Directors, to share some words of greeting.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. As you know, my name is Ed Robin. I'm proud to be a member of the board of Israel Policy Forum. I want to say it's a privilege to be here at Stephen S. Wise Temple, which has such a positive influence on our Jewish community. And it's also a privilege to collaborate, and this is really a groundbreaking collaboration with ADL, which does so much and is so vigilant in the protection of our community. I want to welcome everybody this evening. Israel Policy Forum's mission is to build support among Jewish community leaders and policymakers in Washington, D.C. for pragmatic efforts in support of the goal of a two-state solution as the only way to preserve Israel's future as a secure, Jewish, and democratic state. Today, this goal is being placed into question as never before. The discourse about Israel is eroding and is increasingly characterized by three divides: a widening generational gap between younger and older American Jews, a growing political rift between Democrats and Republicans, and a deepening divide between observant and more secular Jews. Tonight's program focuses on the generational divide and reflects two of Israel Policy Forum's core values, forthrightness and partnership. Across the divide is intended to be an open and honest exploration of the most difficult issues that split our community. This event is also intended to reach outside of our respective bubbles by showcasing a difficult yet constructive debate about these critical issues. We must form relationships to reach wider, more diverse audiences. So we're thrilled to partner with Stephen Wise Temple, ADL, and our co-sponsor, 30 Years After. This is a groundbreaking program which we are very proud to work with ADL to replicate in other cities around the country. Finally, Across the Divide is about identifying the work that lies ahead. It's a starting point for us all to be more informed about the challenges facing our community, to identify and pursue common goals, and to begin to work to cross the divides. Thank you again for being here tonight. It's now my pleasure to welcome my friend Sharon Nazarian, ADL's amazing Senior Vice President for International Affairs, who will introduce this evening's panelists.
Thank you, Ed, so much. Good evening, everyone. As you heard, I'm Sharon Nazarian, and I'm ADL Senior Vice President for International Affairs. For those who may not be familiar with ADL, ADL is an anti-hate organization. We were founded in 1913 to defend the Jewish people, as well as securing justice and fair treatment for all. So our mandate is quite wide, and it's been there from day one. We're a global leader in fighting anti-Semitism, exposing extremism, delivering anti-bias education in schools and other places, and work companies, others would need that kind of education, and also combating hate online. And we know that that's becoming more and more of a challenge daily in our society today. We have a network of 25 offices around the country in the US and one outside in Jerusalem, which is my responsibility, and basically my work lies covering everything outside the US. So the rest of the world is my realm, and as well as Israel. And ADL really is the first call when an anti-Semitic incident happens. Sadly, in Poway just weeks ago, when that tragedy took place, our ADL San Diego office was really literally the first organization on the ground, helping with the trauma center, helping with law enforcement relations, and so on. So we really are a fabric of our societies across the US. ADL does advocate for security and well-being of the Jewish state of Israel, and we actively support this two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We engage in a variety of efforts to counter the BDS movement and other international efforts to delegitimize Israel. We advocate and educate on issues relating to Israeli democracy, religious pluralism, bigotry across Israeli society. Our Israel office, in fact, functions as ADL does in the US, calling out bigotry and discrimination wherever we see it in Israel, actually, as well as the US. Maintaining a strong relationship between the US and Israel is also high on ADL's agenda. For that reason, ADL has partnered with the Israel Policy Forum for a series of panel conversations you just heard about from Ed. These divides are very disconcerting to us. This evening is the beginning, hopefully here in Los Angeles, as we've already done so in New York and Washington, D.C. We hope it'll be the beginning of some of the tough conversations that Ed referenced. We're very happy to be partnering with Stephen S. Wise Temple, as well as 30 Years After. I'm very happy that the Iranian community of Los Angeles is participating and taking part in some of these difficult conversations, and we'll have a member of Tabby will be speaking really from that perspective. I think it'll be important for all of us to hear. For tonight's panel, I would like to introduce the three individuals representing the different voices from the upcoming generation of American Jewry. Very important voices. We're really privileged to have these three speakers with us, traveling all the way from New York. But I really encourage all of you to follow their writings, to expose yourself, as Ed said, to come out of our bubbles, come out of our political bubbles that we surround ourselves with, and to really follow these three important voices, as well as our moderator's voice on tackling the tough issues when it comes to Israel today. So I'll start with Tabby. Tabby Refael is an LA-based writer, speaker, and former executive director and co-founder of 30 Years After. Tabby was born in Tehran, and after the Iranian Revolution, she fled the country with her family and was granted refugee asylum here in the US in 1989. She holds a master's degree in public diplomacy from USC. She's worked for years in the public diplomacy sector, having served as a director of academic affairs at the Consul General of Israel in LA. She's a regular contributor to the Jewish Journal as well as to the Los Angeles Magazine, so her voice will be an important one. I'm really excited that she'll be here with us tonight. Next, Yair Rosenberg is a senior writer at Tablet Magazine, where he covers the intersection of politics, culture, and religion. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and The Guardian. And his writings have received awards from the Religion News Writers Association and the Harvard Center for Jewish Studies. He's covered everything from misrepresentation of Orthodox Jews in the media, to Muslims and Jews in comic books, to political anti-Mormonism. And in his spare time, he creates bots that troll anti-Semites on Twitter. You should all catch him afterwards, tell you how he does that. It's quite creative, I have to say. Finally, and I'm really thrilled to have Dr. Batya Ungar-Sargon, who's an award-winning journalist and the opinion editor for The Forward. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, and Foreign Policy. She holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. So tonight's panel will be moderated by our own Rob Eshman, the former publisher and editor-in-chief of the Jewish Journal. Both the Jewish Journal and Rob have won numerous local and national awards for writing, design, and community leadership. Rob is a graduate of Dartmouth College, who's written for the Jerusalem Post, LA Times, Huffington Post. He's a frequent commentator on LA area radio and television, and has served as a visiting lecturer on journalism at USC and University of Missouri School of Journalism. He writes a blog called Foodism. I hope you all follow him on that. It's named one of the best blogs in Los Angeles by CDBestcom, so I really recommend for you to follow him on that as well. So without further ado, please welcome our panelists tonight. Tonight's conversation should be fantastic. It should be illuminating. It should be uncomfortable as well. And as Rob said, let's keep our minds open and be respectful, and hopefully we'll learn from one another. Rob, the floor is yours.
I can't do it alone. So thank you, Rabbi, thank you, ADL, IPF, thank you, panelists, thank you all for coming. I was bar mitzvahed here in that room in 1973, so I'm clearly on the other side of the generation gap. And I was doing some research for this and found that in 1973, which was right after the war, American Jews gave $650 million to Israel in the aftermath of the war, and something like 13,000 American Jews got up and left and went to Israel to help the country out. So a lot of those were young Jews. And when you think about where we are now, nowhere near that level of urgency, that level of support for Israel, and that's really what we're talking about today, is this generation gap. The most recent statistic I saw, which you guys could tell me if you think I'm being alarmist or not, but there was a poll done, a Jewish population survey of San Francisco Jewry done in 2018 by Jackie Kellys and Stephen Cohn, and they found that only 11% of Jews age 18 to 35, 11% felt strongly attached to Israel. So we've clearly come a long way since 1973, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. So I want to start by asking you to explain that number. How do you explain it? Tabby, why don't we just go down the row?
Now, the 11% you said was from what year?
18 to 35.
No, what ages? What year was that?
Oh, that was done this year.
In 2019.
No, 2018. It was released this year. And they were, the people in the poll were 18 to 35.
Right. So, a couple of things. First of all, I was born in the 80s, and even though I was born and raised in Tehran, the peace capital of the world, thanks, Batya. after the revolution, my parents' generation was of that generation that still remembered Israel as having these existential crises. Now, my parents were born after 1948, but they were, teenagers and into their, about late in their late teens in 67 and in around 73. So their paradigm and mine is completely different. And with my generation, in the sense of for them, those existential crises to Israel means that their generation, as far as the stories they've conveyed to me, still doesn't take Israel for granted. Just as, as a modus operandi, it's just sort of in the back of their minds. Even one, rocket falls into Sderot, and I'm thinking that's terrible, that's a travesty, and my parents' generation operates under the understanding of continued existential threats, the way that they thought in 67 and 73. In fact, when the 67 war broke out, this is before the Iranian Revolution, and Iran and Israel had decent relations. My father, who was a teenager at the time, in Tehran, packed up his bags and ran to enlist into the IDF. So here's a Jew from Tehran in 1967 doing so. And my grandparents actually stopped him at the airport and begged him to come home, right? These are the stories that I grew up with. My generation doesn't have this, even including the ones who were Iranian or weren't or American raised. I know we've all heard this 1,000 times, but Israel's greatest strength and blessing in being an enormous military powerhouse has also rendered it, I don't quite know how to describe it. It's also rendered it, I believe, for my generation, without the type of urgent existential issues that brought together a generation towards Israel. That, let's say, in 1973, everyone here was davening on Yom Kippur, and someone threw those doors open and said, they just announced on the radio that Egypt and the other states have attacked, right? My generation doesn't really have that. So I'm not saying that it's necessarily going to take these kind of emergencies, but at the same time, our entire lifetimes have been filled with not only Israel as a strong powerhouse, but Israel that really works on telling all of us that we're fine, we can take care of ourselves, we will never be erased off the map to Iran or anyone else.
So this idea that it's not the existential crisis Israel, it's not the 73 or 67 Israel. Are there other factors at work, do you think, in shaping these perceptions?
Will I just be a little wary? Can you all hear me? Because I think this is not angled as well as it could be, so that's why I asked. Thank you. So thank you, Rob. Thank you all for being here. This is my third of these panels, and it's really wonderful to be among people who care about these things and want to have these conversations. So I'm always wary of generalizing from one poll, specifically a poll of one particular population, San Francisco. I speak on college campuses usually on average at least twice a month. And the sorts of things that I see, both from the students who come to my events and the ones who don't, who I talk to, don't necessarily match up with that particular poll. And there's other polls, right? Pew did a poll, and they did poll in breakout age groups some years back, right. and they found significant attachment to Israel.
I did pick the most extreme poll.
Deliberately for provocative purposes to get us talking, which is exactly as you should. But it's important to know that there are many different polls that have said a lot of different things, and Batya can speak to that. She's written a little bit about it when it comes to pro-Israel sentiments and criticism of Israel coexisting. So I think that what Tabby gets to, though, is that Israel is seen today by my generation as a strong power, a permanent power, one that isn't threatened existentially, and therefore one that doesn't occupy a huge amount of our brain space all the time. And to the extent that it does occupy your brain space, it's because perhaps it has been dragged into a partisan political fight that makes you uncomfortable. Or perhaps you've been interrogated about it on campus when you never brought Israel up in the conversation and they just noticed you were Jewish. So it has a totally different valence, I think, for people in my generation than it did for a generation before. And that's natural, and it's a testimony to certain successes that Israel has had. And it creates its own attendant challenges. But I don't, so one, I would say, the polls are more complex and young people are more complex. But two, I certainly think that young American Jews don't see Israel as something that's going to go away. And certainly the generation above, you still see much more of that. But then again, that can change. right? Young American Jews also thought, many of them, I think, felt that anti-Semitism was something that was a thing of the past. And it wasn't something that was going to come to their door or to their synagogue, certainly not in America. And I cover anti-Semitism as one of the things that I do for a living, and I'm of that generation. And I too thought it was mostly something that I thought is really real and potent and deadly, mostly in Europe, right? And that's how I thought, I conceptualized it for years doing this work, even though the ADL had statistics and studies that showed you that there were actual threats here in America and that this stuff was going on. It just wasn't part of my reality. And now that's changed. It's changed for many people, I think, in my generation. And so, tomorrow those polls can say something totally different because something totally different can happen.
Batya, even if you don't take the most extreme poll, like I just did, there is a trend that most people will acknowledge of less affiliation, less support for Israel among a young generation. So clearly one of the things at work is this difference in just life experience. We experienced 67 and 73, as Tabby was saying, but what else do you see at work in shaping those numbers?
So let me start by thanking the Israel Policy Forum and the ADL. We would not be sitting here without you guys. Especially, I think your two organizations represent the most important component of our community right now, which is the refusal to accept zero-sum thinking, that it's either Jewish safety and Jewish sovereignty and Jewish rights and Jewish liberation, or Palestinian sovereignty, Palestinian rights, that it's either Jews can not be the victims of hate crimes or other minorities, right? Either Jews or Muslims. Both of these organizations do such an amazing job of simply in their existence resisting the zero sum. And I'm sure that's going to come up again, so I just wanted to get that off my chest. I completely dispute and reject the premise of this panel a little bit, and I'm going to explain why. I think that the generational divide on Israel is actually shrinking. In fact, I think that President Trump has resolved this gap. Thank you. What do I mean by that? So I grew up in Israel, and the Israel I grew up in, Israel today is unrecognizable to me. In the last 2 years, it has simply embraced so many deplorable actions, policies, legislation, and we can get into specifics, but it's done this under the auspices of President Trump's, total support, right? He's sort of a one-man Israel lobby, right? And in that sense, he's so anathema to our community, to the majority of our community, right? 80% of us voted Democrats in the last election, which was truly a referendum on Trump. He's so anathema to our community, and he's so close to Bibi Netanyahu, and he enabled Bibi to really embrace his worst ethno-nationalist tendencies, that in a way he sort of released the older generation from what I think was a kind of bond of silence, a kind of there used to be this feeling like, you can't really criticize Israel. And now there's really a feeling like you absolutely must, right? You cannot not criticize when Benjamin Netanyahu makes a coalition that includes the Jewish Power Party, the Kahanist Party, who are explicitly racist. We cannot not speak up anymore. And in that sense, I think, he really freed the older generation to see things the way that young people do. And so, to me, I don't really see this gap so much as I see the older generation, myself, our whole community really redefining what it means to be pro-Israel in a way that includes the criticism of perhaps the younger generation. I think we have, under the auspices of President Trump's presidency, redefined being pro-Israel as being anti-occupation. That's what I'm seeing. And the good news is the entire Democratic Party has followed us, right? They've all said the entire cohort of people running for office have come out as liberal Zionists, anti-occupation, anti-racist policies, but 100% pro-Israel, including Bernie Sanders, who's the most far to the left. Last week he came out and said, I am 100% pro-Israel. So in that sense, I'm really seeing us finding this voice that truly reflects those values of non-zero-sum thinking.
But is it, so you're saying that what we see as less supportive of Israel is really just more critical but still supportive? Is that how you see it, Yair?
Look, young people are less engaged, right? They're going
Right.
to be, and people who live in San Francisco are more left-wing, right? Like, so I'm not, I agree with Yair. I think that the polling shows many contradictory things. The polling on this topic is not great. It is not consistent over time. But I do feel that the most important thing we should be talking about is how our community has woken up, had sort of the scales fallen from our eyes. We're seeing Bibi through the glasses of Trump, right? We're seeing Israel as embracing Bibi under these very conditions. And I would say that to me, the most important thing is that, like, if you don't like seeing your congresspeople support BDS, you need to speak up on behalf of Palestinian rights on your own terms, right? If you don't want to see things go, sorry, that's left. If you don't want to see things go in that direction, then you need to speak up on your terms. That's what really it's time for our community to do. And I am seeing us do that. I think that is really the direction that we're going in.
Do you see it that way?
Well, I think that Batya raises a good point, which is that the idea of the generational divide, I think, is sometimes exaggerated. And she brings up the fact that the older generation, certainly now, but I think even before, is more willing to criticize Israel than people realize, and always was. Perhaps they've become more emboldened and more angry, as everyone has in America in these last few years, and I think due to real-world reasons. But the younger generation also, sometimes people write off, younger Jews who are critical of Israel, they don't know anything, they lack connection, right? Or they don't take anti-Semitism seriously, or they don't take the reason Israel is there seriously. And in my experience, and they don't take, say, anti-Semitism on the progressive left seriously, for example. And I find none of that is true. And I find that including many people who have more critical or nuanced views on Israel of my generation, they are often the first to want to have a conversation about how that can bleed into anti-Semitism, say, in progressive spaces. I remember being at a very big conference for young Jewish professionals from all sorts, people not just in Jewish stuff, but like Silicon Valley, all sorts of things. And they had a breakout session where they said, here are a few topics, but also you can make your own up. And so people put up a poster and said, I want to talk about this. And I and one other person both independently came up with, I want to talk about anti-Semitism in progressive spaces, because most of the people in this room were in different sorts of progressive spaces, professionally and personally. And half the room went to that specific circle, and nothing got done because we were all in the same circle and we didn't have enough time, right? But everyone there actually had things they wanted to say, and it's actually this sort of, by writing off and saying, oh, the younger generation, they don't care about Israel, or they don't understand why it's there, or they don't care about anti-Semitism, or they're naive, right? They're actually very serious about these things, but often they're not invited into those conversations because they get written off.
But that raises the question, Tabby, you could weigh in on this as well. Is part of the reason that there is that these polls reveal what they do reveal, whether you believe them or not, is that it doesn't feel safe to be pro-Israel in a progressive space these days. And most Jews are progressive, most Jews are liberal. So young Jews, especially.
I definitely think that that's one of the reasons why young Jews really do actually care very strongly about talking about Israel in a thoughtful way and a smart way. Is because they want to, A, say the things they want to say politically, and B, they don't want them to get weaponized and misused by people they know who are out to get them and out to get Israel for the wrong reasons. And that's not just true when it comes to criticizing Israel. It comes true when it's talking about anti-Semitism and talking about the Jewish community. Young Jews are very aware of this. As a reporter on anti-Semitism, I encounter this a lot. It's easy to report on right-wing anti-Semitism. If a white supremacist throws a firebomb at your synagogue or says something at an event at your Hillel, everyone there is going to talk to me, right? If, and I'm speaking hypothetically, except this is totally true, at an elite law school, perhaps in the last month, somebody after a meeting of different minority groups on campus with the Jewish community for on a tension, an issue about working together, said to a non-Jewish student, I just effing hate the Jews. And then that was, conveyed to the Jewish law students on campus, and they got very upset, and it became a controversy on campus, and there was retaliation against Jewish students who talked about it, and against the non-Jewish student who told the Jewish students about it, and then to the point that it's very hard to get those people to talk on the record about what happened at their school, not because it didn't happen, not because there's not a paper trail, but because these are their friends and their colleagues, and they're very worried about what will happen if I speak out on this particular issue. What will be the consequences for me? And so as a result, progressive anti-Semitism disappears because people can't talk about it because they are actually, this is the space that they're in. So they're more scared to. They're not scared to talk about it on the right because they're not in that space, right? And there are no consequences for them for talking about it.
Right.
Yeah, so it's, young Jews want to have these conversations, and I think we should have them.
So I'll tell you something about me. I'm really good at living in the past. It makes me really delightful at dinner parties. I'm not kidding. And when so Sharon, first of all, I jumped right into your question, but Sharon mentioned in the bio about how my family and I were given a refuge. We came to America in 1989 as protected refugees. Thank you, Sharon, for that, your lovely words, and Israel Policy Forum, ADL, WISE, everyone. When we came in June 1989, 30 years ago, this June, George Bush the elder was president, and I distinctly remember conversations between my dads and my uncles, because if you ever go to a Persian dinner party, every male in the family, and now the women too, think that they're all political analysts, so they all get together on one side. That's literally all that happens. Before Fox News had their roundtables of unbiased observers and things, the Persian uncles and the dads were just going at it. And I just distinctly remember, I was 7, but conversations of Baker, no, he's a real bastard. No, we'll give him some time. And 30 years ago when we came to this country, I remember people were wondering whether Republicans were pro-Israel, right? And then a few years afterwards, you had a Democratic president mediate Oslo, right? And then 30 years later, it's so exceptional and incredible to me when you're speaking about whether there's really a space within progressive conversations and, congressional offices to be pro-Israel, unabashedly pro-Israel, as I am. And 30 years later, you get, as you all know, a House resolution that can't really condemn anti-Semitism without including a lot of other things into it as well. And I was trying to think of if I was, for example, a college student on campus today, and if I was a registered Democrat, I happen to be an independent, and I saw a lot of these values that are so close to my heart in terms of domestic progressive issues, right? Including now, Alabama, Missouri, all of it. You put that in one basket, and then something unprecedented happens. For the first time, you get 2 blatantly pro-BDS members of Congress, right? You get last week another member of Congress who says that, and it really was a lie that, Palestinians gave Jews fantastically benevolent refuge, right, after the Holocaust and all of this. And if I'm an average college student, I would honestly, Rob, I wouldn't feel shaken to my core. I really wouldn't. I have friends who are diehard Democrats, and some of them are diehard liberals. I wouldn't feel shaken to my core. I'd still, still sticking with the Democratic Party and so on in progressive circles. But I would be wondering a little bit about, as Barry Weiss said, actually, because I was watching your review of you guys back in the fall as part of the second, I think, forum in this series. Barry Weiss of the New York Times said right now she feels politically homeless, right? And I thought that was such a powerful term in the sense of the young Jews that I know very few on the right, and the ones that I know on the left, I think are starting to feel a little bit of that political homelessness. Now the question is this, and I want us to listen very carefully about this. In some ways, I'm probably answering the last question you're having, which is where do we go from here? I was a campus leader at UC San Diego. I was VP of our pro-Israel group, and I worked for many years as Director of Academic Affairs at the consulate here for 7-state jurisdiction. There's only so much that young American Jews can connect with their Judaism and with the Jewish state by being anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Does that make sense? So what that means is that for them to be able to have events, to write op-eds in the Daily Bruin or the Cal Berkeley paper or anywhere else, continuing to criticize or demonize as they should the anti-Zionists, the anti-Semites. This can't be sustainable.
Right.
To be anti-Semitism in most of the things you do, and the funding is all there for it right now, and to be anti-Zionism can only get you so far because eventually you burn out.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
It's a very good point. I just want to pick up on it in the sense that it's not just true for the side of the equation of people who are, we're against the anti-Zionists, we're against anti-Semitism. And I speak for myself here because, of course, these are things that I cover a lot. That's not an identity, that's an opposition, right? What's the content to your Jewish identity beyond that sort of thing, right? It's partly exhausting because there isn't, what's the core meaning, right? What is it actually that it is for you to be Jewish? And that's also true, and I see it in the flipped version, right, which might be a lot smaller, but it's there, right, which is the people who define themselves as anti-everything Israel is and does and ever will be, right? And that sort of thing also, that there are certain organizations out there that are anti-Zionist, but what is their vision, therefore, of Jewish life in the world and in America, right? And for the Jews who are in whatever Israel becomes instead, right? There isn't that actual thought, right? There isn't that actual core, that meaning. And this sort of thing it's not healthy, it's not sustainable, and it leads to very, arguments of increasing virulence and basically nowhere for them to go. And so I think something that, Jewish communities have to think about is, what does positive Jewish content look like in America? What does positive Jewish identity look like in America? I like working for a place like Tablet Magazine, and I suspect Batya enjoys working for a place like The Forward because a lot of what we do isn't about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but about what it is to be Jewish, right, in today's world, right, in the places we find ourselves.
But doesn't that always go back to, do you find yourself somehow always being sucked back into the Israel argument, even when you're in those places? And Batya, I really wanted you to weigh in as well on the left and the acceptance of Israel within the left, because you've taken a lot of criticism from people on your left as well, when you criticized Ilhan Omar.
And to my right.
And to your right. Well, that's a given.
Yeah, wait, so what's the exact question?
Well,
The answer is
can
yes,
you
I
be,
have.
We have some mean tweets. Can you read them?
Is one of the reasons that there's some degree of distancing among young people in Israel that it's just an uncomfortable place to be pro-Israel on the left these days?
I think if you ask Abe Foxman, he would say, when was it ever not comfortable to be a Zionist on the left? He totally thinks that he'll tell you back in the day, you think it was easy to be on college campus and be pro-Israel 30 years ago, 50 years ago?
And it's true. It's like Tabby was saying. We forget. We forget these historic kind of changes and what it was like and what it is like now. But it was hard. But go ahead.
I think I would say, I think there's two things here. The first is that the Jewish community is a little bit at fault here because for the last 50 years, we kind of outsourced our identity to Israel. So instead of teaching our children how to read the Talmud or, engage in our texts, it was Israel. It was kind of a shortcut. And someone like Michael Steinhardt, for example, who's an atheist, who then decides, I'm going to use birthright to shortcut Jewish continuity, right? To get, and then of course all of the gender stuff involved in not just him, but, the birthright itself, this idea that Jewish continuity is about women having babies, right? That's also extremely problematic, right? So we sort of abandoned our gorgeous, gorgeous tradition and culture in favor of this thing that's much easier, we'll go on a trip to Israel or just Israel. I think the reason that happened was because, as Tabby said, Israel was really under threat. And of course, we want to stand up for other Jews. That's so totally natural and normal. So it wasn't just cynical, I don't think. I do think it was lazy, but I don't think it was only cynical.
I want to take Batya to task with this.
Yes.
And if I upset you, I'll send you some tea afterwards,
You won't
I
upset
promise.
me.
You ever had Persian tea? Cardamom. You are a fast speaker. Okay. So Batya, you said that you think American Jews for too long have outsourced a lot of the beauty of their Judaism to Israel. Do you think this was for the negative?
Well, no, as I was saying, but I want to hear your criticism, I promise, but I'll just finish the point.
Okay.
So as I was saying, I don't think it was cynical. I think a lot of it had to do with seeing Israelis under threat, which is a horrific thing to see even today. You know, we're all kind of glued to the TV, listening to Galgalatz, like whenever anything happens in the South, right? But I do think that, so it was a combination, so I think that really hurt. You know, a student, a young person who has a really strong connection to the Jewish tradition is not going to feel threatened when they go into a lefty space by people who are anti-Zionist, because that's not where, like, Zionism is not where their Jewish identity lies, right? It's where their Zionism lies there. It's where their ideas about Jewish nationalism lie. It's where their ideas about Israel lie. But they have another sense of what it means to be a Jew. So it doesn't penetrate quite as deeply. If your only sense of what it means to be a Jew is supporting Israel, then when somebody encounters you who doesn't support Israel, it's extremely triggering, extremely frustrating, extremely upsetting. And so I think that was the first thing. And I would say the second thing is that the Israel education did not prepare students for, number one, even, you know, back before, you know, the current iteration of Israel, didn't prepare them for the complexities of Israel. There's an occupation going on, right? How many times does Hebrew school prepare students to acknowledge that extremely problematic reality that Israel is depriving millions of Palestinians of civil rights? And I'm sure, we can talk about, it's obviously not only Israel's fault. Just putting that, thank you. So it was a combination of, number one, making Israel the be-all and end-all of Jewish identity, and number two, making it a very simplistic version of Israel, not preparing them for the complexity. So there was like a failure in the Jewish education. And so I think that those are the two things that combined to make it difficult to be Jewish on the left, on the far left. At the same time, of course, it's horrific to hear about students who are Zionists going into these spaces with people who have values that otherwise we totally share, and feeling like they can't, that their values are, today there was another article that's being called white supremacy, right? So it was this perfect storm of like the way that, we had crafted Jewish identity, and then the way that the left has sort of formulated, its core causes. Tabby, come at me.
So, here's the thing. I'm an unabashed Zionist, and part of this actually started in my day school in Iran after the revolution, covered in hijab, mandatory, even though I was a Jew at a more Jewish-leaning school, every day screaming in 1987, Marg bar Israel, Marg bar America, death to Israel, death to America, right? When you escape that kind of scenario, a lot of the Zionism is already breeded within you, right? And to Batya's point that you can have a young person going in to a progressive, to a meeting of progressives or super lefty, as your term, and not be jarred if they're really criticizing Israel, I would say, I hope at least one person claps for this. I would say, I know I totally set you up for that. I'm not sure I want to meet a young Jew who can go into a super lefty meeting and not be jarred and upset and even a little bit shaken to their core if someone is really trampling Israel under the bus at one of these meetings. I'll wait for the applause.
Well,
No, hold on.
okay.
And here's the second thing about outsourcing American Jewish identity to Israel. So I completely hear where you're coming from.
Thank you.
Really do. My issue with it is this. I think outsourcing inevitably implies giving away a part of yourself to a foreign entity, right? Outsourcing your employees or your sewing factories, whatever it is, to some foreign country. It's not within you, right? Anybody on Shark Tank can tell you that they prefer to keep the jobs in the US. My issue with the outsourcing our Judaism is this. We're not outsourcing it to a foreign entity if what Israel should be to us is within ourselves. Israel is not a foreign entity for me, anyways. By the way, I don't claim to speak, as some people think I do, for even the community of Iranian American Jews. Their values are really changing as well. We're really not as homogenous as people think. But if I had to outsource, let's say, that Jewish identity to part of Israel, I would say bring it on for me. Because I just Israel's not somewhere foreign, right? Accents withstanding and so on, as you would get on the telephone if you tried to call Dell or T-Mobile or anybody else for outsourcing. It's part and parcel of within me. Israel, what I hope we could return at some point, especially for the younger generation, is that Israel is part of the Jew and the Jew is part of Israel. If you put your identity out into it, it's not foreign. Israel's not foreign to you, or I hope it wouldn't be, right? Which is my take
See, I
on
think
it.
that's a bigger applause line. But call me crazy. But Yair, you speak a lot on college campuses.
Yeah.
So I want you to respond to what the reality of what Jewish kids feel there and whether that's creating some of this distance. And as part of that, what I hear when I talk to a lot of college students who are my son's age, my daughter's age, they don't even agree to the premise of an ethno-nationalist state and how it could be a democracy. So it's the very foundational aspect of the need for a Jewish state that they reject and that their friends who aren't Jewish on the left completely reject. And I think, to me, that seems like a bigger intellectual hurdle for a lot of these students.
It's interesting. So again, like if you go to one of the big things when you talk about college campuses, you're already doing it wrong. And we do this in the Jewish media all the time, right? You speak of it as a sort of general monolith when there are in fact thousands of campuses and they're very, very different. I go to many campuses across America where they've never even heard of BDS. And in fact, they've done studies, and most people, and not alone most students, have no idea what BDS is. They don't have complicated questions about Israel as an ethno-nationalist state. It's not a thing that they've ever considered or thought about, right? And like, I remember going to, I spoke at, was it Michigan State University, was it? And I asked them, like, do you guys like ever have like, I did a talk on anti-Semitism, like, do you guys have like BDS controversies and things like that? And they're like, not really, on occasion, some resolution, this or that. It barely, like, no one ever, doesn't really register on campus. And they're like, because they're like, students don't really care about things. The only time like they could remember, they said that students actually came out and got politically involved was when the local city decided to ban mopeds. And then everyone got really mad. And suddenly all the students took to the streets and got very politically engaged because this is actually how they live their lives. And I just, and I go back to when I was an undergrad at Harvard, and we have the student council elections, which they have every year. And I'm bringing this up for a deliberate reason, which is to show you that all these things that you have notions when you hear that, about how serious they are, how important they are, and the leaders of tomorrow. Was it like second to last year there? That every year in the student council elections for the presidency, whatever, there's always a joke ticket. It makes it fun. They do funny things. They have some theme or whatever. This joke ticket this year, they staged an assassination on their candidate at the debate, right? They were they were really good at it. They also won. And that was because nobody actually thought, first of all, like a third of the campus even voted in the elections, which is something to keep in mind with almost every single one of these sorts of resolutions on campus. Pro or con for BDS, almost no students actually participated in the vote, right? Almost no one participated, right? And nobody actually thought that the outcomes actually mattered, or that what the student council did was consequential at what we would consider one of these premier university campuses in America. People don't, so when we say like college campuses, Oberlin is so different from Ohio State. Like it's universes apart, and I've been to those areas both, and so so I don't find that most kids are asking. I do find actually that most Jewish kids are condescended to and not given enough credit for the sorts of ways they deal with these issues. Sort of a theme I keep coming back to, but like it goes in both directions, right? We hear a lot.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, we hear a lot on college campuses. On occasion, you can sort of like count maybe on two hands the number of times, like publicly we know, where a donor put their foot down because, say, Breaking the Silence or some left-wing group on Israel was trying to come to the Hillel or to the campus, right, with Jewish backing, and then like a donor said, well, you know what, I'm pulling out if you make this happen, right, you guys can't do this. The kids can't handle it. What happens? They might go, and then they'll suddenly become brainwashed, and like all their opinions will change, right? Think of that like the level of condescension and the lack of faith in like young Jews and their intellectual curiosity and ability to suss out complicated issues. And then now you sort of have this sort of reaction in the opposite direction, where people are like, American Jews, they shouldn't go on birthright, right? Because birthright doesn't have both sides. People should sign pledges that I won't go on birthright. I only will go, right, on a two-sided trip, right? As though American Jews are absolute morons and they go on a birthright trip and they don't have access to the internet, cable news, right? Or pretty much anything where any of us read about these issues ad nauseum or hear about them and think about them and debate them. And they've never been to a Passover Seder or Shabbat table, right? So it's incredibly odd to me, right? I hear sometimes, there's certain slogans that get thrown around on parts of the Jewish left, to the Jewish community, "You never told me," right? To which I always wonder, then how did you find out? So young Jews, what I find, and I'm not saying all college campus kids are amazing and intellectually curious, whatever, young Jews that I meet at these Hillels, right, and again, I purposely go to meals and not just to my events because I want to get to the people who are not actually coming to my events, right, that we sell them short all the time. And they are actually trying to balance competing things about nationhood, right, and defense and protection of the other, right, and all these competing values. And they don't always land where I would land, right, but they are actually considering all of those things, and they're saying them in really thoughtful ways, and often we're just not listening. And I think it would be better if we sort of step back, right, and let them actually do that. And I think what's cool about these panels is, some of you may know, but after this panel is over, every single time IPF and ADL do this, they have the young professionals go afterwards for a dessert reception, and they sit in circles and they talk about this stuff that they just heard, and many other things. And I have actually sat in just as a participant on these things for the last one that we did in Washington, D.C., and it's astonishing to hear what people say. And if we could just sit a bunch of Jewish donors, right, and a bunch of really fire-breathing leftists who want to kill birthright down, and just say, listen to these people, right? They're not, they are all right, right? And give them some runway rather than trying to guide them in every step of the way.
Can I ask you something about
Yes.
the Jewish students you meet on campus? I want to ask you a question about race. Do you ever feel like they feel squeezed in by other students on the left who make them feel like privileged white people? And then what do the Jews of color, the Mizrahim and so on, and the Sephardim, how do they respond to that? Because I also feel myself as, part of this. God knows I'm not a white Jew, right?
Yeah. So it's very campus specific because on some campuses there isn't this discourse about, white supremacy, white privileged folks and all that, right? You go to most campuses in middle America, that's not actually super live. But you will have those sorts of things. If you look, you can find videos on YouTube. This isn't hard, right? Some event is happening with a speaker talking about Israel, and people will get up, pull up a Palestinian flag and say, fight white supremacy or something like that, as though Israel is a white supremacist country. There are many things that you can ding Israel for, many issues with regard to racism and treatment of minorities, a country that is 50%
But this is what I'm wondering, is
Middle Eastern,
if I'm
no.
an average white, I should say Ashkenazi Jewish student on campus, would I feel like I wouldn't be able to defend Israel properly because I somehow fall into some kind of white privileged category that the rest of campus loathes?
On certain campuses, that divide will be weaponized to prevent your voice from being heard,
Okay.
Which will then, of course, create more pressure on, say, if you're a Persian student who's pro-Israel, then you feel like you have to speak up, but you also don't want that issue to define your identity, but suddenly you're the only people will listen to, right?
That's
It is a
interesting you bring that up
complicated
because at UCLA, really recently, it's all over the news now, there was a guest lecturer who presented and called Israelis white supremacists. And the two girls who stood up against him in the class were Persian Jewish girls.
thing. Yeah.
Right?
Well, this goes to this idea of intersectionality, which I know you've spoken about before, and whether progressive Jews feel comfortable in these spaces that are called intersectional spaces where people feel that Jews represent part of the privileged class. That doesn't come up for these students, you're saying?
Oh, it totally
I'm
does.
getting a much
Depends
more
which campus
optimistic.
you're on. Depends which campus you're on. If they're
Uh-huh.
super intersectional, you should know, I'm going to just plug this. Batya has a whole article on intersectionality that she wrote at some length. She has a critique of it. Maybe she'll share it. I happen to be one of the rare people in the Jewish commentary world who actually thinks intersectionality is totally fine when it comes to Jews, if you read the theory, right? The way it's applied is vastly different from what was actually originally conceived. So there was this African-American theorist, she's active today, Columbia Law School, other places, Kimberly Crenshaw, and she wanted to come up with a theory that would enable people to spot forms of bigotry and oppression that they previously couldn't see because they occurred at intersections of identity. So what does that mean? So she wrote specifically about black women working in a particular setting where they experienced particular forms of discrimination that simple black men in that community didn't experience and white women in that community didn't. But if you were a black woman, something unique happened to you and certain things happened to you. And only if you use this lens to see the intersection of identities could you spot this unique form of oppression. It's actually a brilliant idea. It's totally true, and you know where it would be really useful for understanding a complicated form of oppression? Jews who look white who also get attacked by white supremacists. Right? Because on the one hand, they accrue privileges of looking white. They're not going to be thrown into the criminal justice system. They're not going to get pulled over, right, on the street for looking like they look, right? And on the other hand, right, they're also going to get shot in synagogues like no other group of people who has their skin color does. And the only way you can conceptualize it, understand they exist at a nexus of being white and being Jewish, And what does that mean? And yet we have almost no conversation about that. There are some theorists who are trying to do it. There's an academic a law scholar at Berkeley named David Schraub, who has an entire academic article starting to raise this issue. But intersectional spaces have largely failed to deal with Jews as an intersectional category and as an intersectional idea, right? So obviously there are also Jews of color, right? And they experience, and that's also Jew and Jew of color, right? That's an intersection, right? White passing or white presenting or conditionally white, there are different terms used. Jews who are, Ashkenazi typically, right? That's another one. And so intersectionality as a theory, it's a great idea. In practice, like many theories that have good ideas and good intentions, somehow an asterisk gets put in, and it says, except for the Jews, right? So, communism, the brotherhood of all men, right, and everyone's equal, except for the Jews, who we put in the gulag if they don't give up their weird particular customs, right? And Christianity is universal love, well, unless you're Jewish. And like throughout history, all of these beautiful ideologies that had really good things to teach us somehow carved out exceptions and new rules for Jews. And it's a thing that if you want to fight, and this is the anti-Semitism reporter in me, if you want to fight anti-Semitism, find those exceptions and attack them and point them out. And people of good faith will notice them and they will help you, right? And the other ones, you'll know, well, okay, you're the problem. And that's something I think we should think about when we think about intersectionality.
Batya, doesn't that make progressive spaces even more challenging for Jews and pro-Israel Jews?
You keep asking me the same
Well,
question
you are.
that I don't want to answer. Look, I'm not for the progressive left. I'm for you. I'm for the Jewish community. So I'll just say what I want to say to you, which is that I think we're living at a time in Jewish history that's really magnificent. In 2,000 years, Jews have never had this much power. We've got the army, and if things really get bad here, right? We've got Tzahal, and we have overwhelming support in every level of the U.S. government. I mean, it's just, right? When somebody says something anti-Semitic, it's really bad on the left. On the right, there's that kind of like the Israel clause, but if they're pro-Israel, it's kind of like people push it under the rug. It's terrible. So on the one hand, Jews have never had so much power. And on the other hand, we're getting murdered in our synagogues for being Jewish, right? We're extremely vulnerable, and I think we're all feeling really vulnerable. That tension is something that definitely the far left is not interested in talking about or thinking about, but I think we need to do more thinking about it and talking about it. It's very hard because we're feeling really vulnerable, but at the same time, we're sort of this really, really privileged minority in this country. And I don't mean privilege in the banal way. I just mean in the sense that our politicians really, really love us and care about us. Our police officers really love us and care about us. We're protected in ways that other minorities just aren't. Like the African American community is my belief that this country is still waging war against them. Mass incarceration, the school to prison pipeline, every encounter with a police officer is potentially fatal. We just don't have to deal with that stuff. The Muslim community is under, increased scrutiny from law enforcement, and you pay zero price for Islamophobia in the public sphere. So if you're a politician, you say something Islamophobic or racist about Muslims, you don't really pay a price for that. This is horrific. And I think that it behooves us to use our privilege to stand up for other minorities as much as we can. Because again, it's not a zero-sum game. Thanks to the work of these great organizations, we know that. It's not a zero-sum game. And so, my thinking on this is that it is crucial that we recognize both our power, our privilege, as well as our vulnerability, and that within our own spaces, we think about creative ways to protect ourselves, which is our right, to demand that other people protect us, which is our right, but also how can we use our bodies to defend and to protect and to stand up for people who don't have it as good as we do, whether that's the Palestinians, whether it's Muslim Americans, whether it's African Americans, whether it's the Latino community. In some ways we're really good at that. I think on the immigration front, our community really shows up. But on other issues, mass incarceration, where's our community, right? We should be sort of at the forefront leading, we should be there. So I guess that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
want to
just
say?
very quickly, and something that Batya just gets at right there about showing up for particular causes. Intersectionality has this theory, and then there's the way it comes out in practice, which seems to be very different often than what the theory would dictate. But that's because intersectionality in practice, no one has the time to think about every locus of oppression, all the intersections of identities. So what they effectively do is they outsource this sort of thing to particular communities. So the African American students on campus tell you which issues matter to their community, and everyone in the intersectional coalition shows up for that one. Right? And the Muslim American students do the same thing, and so on and so forth. And Jews are often not included in that unless they toe particular lines. But here's the thing, right? One of the ways Jews kind of get included in that is by showing up to all of these sorts of causes, which matter to us anyway, right? And are actually important to many of us as well, right? And if Jews show up to sorts of progressive spaces and causes, even when they know there are people who are going to try to push them out, because there are these anti-Zionist inquisitors. Are you or have you ever been a Zionist? And if you have, get out. And we're talking about animal rights. Right? And they're going to try to do that, and you should not leave, right? And people should be in those spaces, and this is what Batya gets all of these attacks for, because she refuses to be only one thing. And Jews should show up in the full complexity of their identities to these things, and then the other students who are in these coalitions will discover, oh, there are specifically Jewish issues and things that Jews care about, like Israel's vulnerability, like Jews' vulnerability, and that matters too, in addition to the other things that we should be talking about.
Right, and I'll just say one more thing, which is, I completely agree with that, everything that you said, and I just, you're all already on the left. Like, you're all progressive. We all care about the same things. We all want a just world with equality for everybody, okay? So we are all on the left, and I want you to join me in rejecting the idea that we should cede that to the people who wish us harm. Just join me in that, so I'm not out there alone doing it, okay? Okay, great.
Was I supposed to make an announcement about questions you were, that the audience is supposed to be asking questions?
There are note cards being
Is there a
passed around, it
mechanism
looks
for
like?
the audience to ask questions? Cards, there are. And when were we supposed to do that? What is this? Oh, man.
Rob will combine similar questions like, could Yair talk slower?
One of the things that I've noticed that we haven't spoken about is that there's one of the changes that's happened since my generation to your generation is that Arafat died. So you have a generation that didn't grow up with this symbol of the Palestinian cause, who was not, to Jews, a great symbol of the Palestinian cause. Batya and I just spent 2 weeks, I forget how long it was now.
Certainly felt that way.
It felt like it. We spent, I don't know, 4 days visiting. No, it was great. I was sick, so it felt longer. We spent 4 days with a group called Encounter touring the Palestinian territories. And we met incredibly articulate, young, vibrant, thoughtful Palestinian thought leaders. And I think one of the differences now versus the last generation of Jews is that Palestinians are connecting to young Jews in a way that Yasser Arafat couldn't. And that by giving up kind of this campaign of terror, which they really haven't engaged in a serious way since the Second Intifada, Hamas, Gaza separate, the thought leaders are reaching, Palestinians are reaching across Jews. And I wonder if you think that's really had this effect of making young Jews, young American Jews, more sympathetic, more empathetic with the Palestinian cause.
I wanted to make all of you more sympathetic with the Palestinian cause. The Palestinian community, especially in the West Bank, let's put Gaza aside for a minute. The Palestinian community in the West Bank has by and large abandoned violent resistance, okay? The data supports this. The data supports this. The leadership supports this. The number of Jews being killed by terrorism in the West Bank is almost down, has the numbers, it's been a complete decrease. I'm not saying that it's never happens anymore, but what I'm saying is that in the second Intifada, there was widespread support within the community. I hear you. I'm looking right at you because I feel your pain and I feel your frustration, okay? So the knife intifada, which happened about 3 years ago, did not have the same support in the Palestinian community as the second Intifada. During the second Intifada, if you blew up a bus, you were a hero. With the knifing attacks, people walk around, they say, oh, maybe he's mentally ill. This is just when you...
Shh. Hey, let's not have...
Separate welfare, we're going to talk about that in the question. Write it on your question. I'm going to answer that. Write it on your little piece of paper. I'm going to talk about that. It's an important question. So when you spend time in the West Bank, as I do, and you spend time in Palestinian communities, which Israelis are not allowed to do, by the way. So they're not allowed to go into Palestinian communities on the other side of the wall. You hear again and again that not only have Palestinians given up the desire to engage in violence, but they are more and more engaged in wanting to reach out to our community, to the Jewish community. So 10 years ago, you would go there and they would talk about the Jews. There was no difference between the Israelis and the Jewish community. Now you go there, I go there with my Jewish star, and the first thing every Palestinian says to me is, we don't have a problem with Jews, we have a problem with the occupation. And they're right to have a problem with the occupation, right? They're right to have a problem with being systematically deprived of their rights, right? And it's our job as the eyes and ears and the conscience of Israelis who cannot see that, who cannot go there, to convey this message. To convey this message not just to Israelis, not just to our community, but to our politicians, right? To demand that they help end the occupation in a way that does not threaten Israeli lives. That's on us, right? We cannot cede that point to the far left. We simply cannot. We have to be the ones out there agitating to end the occupation on our terms in a way that does not endanger Jewish lives. Okay? That's what I'll say about that.
It is a change. I mean, this has been a sea change in how the American Jewish, especially younger American Jews, are perceiving Palestinians.
You know what it is, Rob? You're so right. It's not only that Arafat was really a disgusting, person and really your classic villain, whereas Mahmoud Abbas is just kind of there, right? This is live streaming, so I apologize to the Abbas family if this gets to them. It's all, you know what it is? It's also things like the young teenager, a female, beautiful young girl who slapped an Israeli soldier, right? The slap sort of captured around the world. Remember? Things like this, campaigns like this, they have so much power. I mean, who wouldn't have the heart to, on the face superficial level of it, identify with a teenager slapping, someone in the position of a military, right, of the IDF. These kinds of messages have so much power, and the biggest difference is that they're so much more magnified now. You understand that if that incident had occurred maybe 20, 25 years ago, the Western world wouldn't have known about it. It would have been a blip in Haaretz somewhere. J-Post may have reported about it, but now it's New York Times. I mean, it's really all over, and it's magnified, and it's shareable. And whether that's going to be a good thing for the Jewish community or not is a whole separate discussion. But I can tell you that wasn't there before.
It wasn't there before. The other thing that raises is that was perceived very differently in Israel. People weren't so sympathetic to that woman in Israel. And it raises this issue of what's been called kind of the mirror opposite between young Israeli Jews and young American Jews. And I wonder going forward if you think we're in for, even if you don't accept the worst analyses of where young American Jews are in Israel, if we're looking for bigger divisions down the line between these two generations. Young Israeli Jews tend to vote to the right, young American Jews vote largely to the left. Young American Jews despise Bibi and the government now. Young Israeli Jews, mostly support the coalition. So where does that take us in the future between Israelis and Americans?
So is it the Israeli journalist Gershom Gorenberg always likes to say when I ask questions like this that he reports on the past, not the future. So like these sorts of trends are always, important. But of course, Israelis repeatedly, and to the chagrin of, say, hawkish right-wing American Jews at the time, including people involved in AIPAC, voted for peace governments, including in the face of Intifada. And then, history happened, and suddenly now Israel's the right-wing people and the American Jews are the left-wing people. And so I could, yes, if all things stay the same, right? Just as people were saying, if all trends stay the same, the Haredim will be the majority of the Israeli population, right? But now we look and we see actually that Haredim are more integrating into Israeli society, and the ultra-Orthodox are actually, their birth rates are stabilizing a little bit. So I'm always wary of projecting trends like one-to-one into the future, right? I think it's more, the question is how do you deal with them in the present? And I think that the American Jews shouldn't shrink from confronting people like, say, Benjamin Netanyahu's son, Yair Netanyahu, who has begun a career as a Twitter troll. I highly recommend you read his Twitter feed if you want to be alarmed at what privilege and entitlement can do to someone who probably was born with a high IQ and given a significant education, but largely makes arguments that could convince absolutely nobody who didn't already agree with him, and even the people who agree with him probably cringe at them. And like, say what you will about Netanyahu, but his father, but he knows how to make an argument that might actually persuade somebody, right, who doesn't already agree with him. And there are a lot, and Yair Netanyahu is not an exception, right? And there's a fair number of people within that sort of space within Israel, and they deserve to be challenged. And they deserve to be challenged by a younger American Jewish generation, many of whom have been to Israel many times, many of whom speak Hebrew vastly more fluently than their elders, right, and are capable of registering that challenge, and doing so in a way that's designed to actually persuade the rest of the Israeli public that these people are wrong, right? Not doing it in a way that I, the superior American Jew, who doesn't vote in your election and doesn't serve in your army, right, know what's best for you. But more just saying, is this really the best you can do? Do you really think that this guy, like, because most Israelis, like, actually look at your Netanyahu, right, and think that he's, like, a tool, right? And, like, pointing out that that's true also of his political opinions and the way he expresses them is actually valuable. And so I think that, I would be wary of projecting, trends into the future about politics and whether all American Jews will be hard left and all Israeli young Jews, whatever, they'll be hard right, because those things have shifted many times. But today, I think that we should challenge those people, and we should be forthright. And, Yair Netanyahu, for example, spoke at an AIPAC event. Now, obviously, it was a side event, and so on and so forth. The guy has no business speaking at an AIPAC event, right? And there are people who are involved in AIPAC who are smart enough to know that, right? Like, the guy has not, what has he accomplished in his life other than being the son of somebody else? And, at least Donald Trump got elected president. So, like, there's no reason why, like, these sorts of people, like, don't give them
So why do we have to deal with Donald Trump
Jr.? We don't have to
Jr.?
build their platforms. We don't have to, we don't have to help them out.
Yeah.
And the American Jewish community should be a little bit more conscious about those sorts of things and should be comfortable putting its foot down, but also doing it, and this is really, really, really important, and this is one of the things that IPF does very well, thinking about how you actually talk to real Israelis on the ground. Don't condescend to them, right? Just as I said, don't condescend to young American college students. Most Israelis are not Yair Netanyahu. They're a lot smarter. They have a lot of competing considerations that they're going through their heads, right? And treat them like grown-ups. And treat them as morally serious people, and you will find, right, that they will respond in kind. Very often I feel sometimes the left-wing critiques of Israel that come out of this country, right, like the classic metaphor, right, if your friend, if your brother's driving drunk, you take away the keys. So this is a nice metaphor, right, for people who really don't like the settlement enterprise and the occupation and where it's taking Israel. But imagine if you went to that brother and said to them, like, when they're like, you're a drunk and you're an addict and I'm taking away your keys, right? This is probably a very effective mechanism of actually getting him to listen to you, right, or would, like, tick him off, right? So, like, American Jews going up to Israelis and saying, you're all a bunch of drunks, right, is not a very effective metaphor, right? It's not a very effective way of, dealing with these issues. And so coming up with ways to actually talk about these things and respectfully do so. And so right now, here's a panel of American Jews talking about American issues, right? But having those conversations with Israelis, right, and Israeli translators, interpreters, and the people who want to do this, who are young people in Israel, who are trying to do this, right, and the people who almost succeeded in, beating Netanyahu in the last election, right? And those who read me don't know, I haven't hidden my preferences in that election, right? There's a lot of Israelis to work with. Treat them seriously, don't condescend to them, and work with them, and things will happen.
What have you found are effective ways to bridge? Because there is, in the present, forget about the future if we want, but there is this gap between how young Israelis vote, how young American Jews vote, how they think, how we think. Partly, these are people who came of age during the Second Intifada, which was this horrendous terrorism brought into their homes, brought into their streets, while young American Jews were going off to college and having fun. So what do you see as effective ways to bridge the gap?
Well, I'll just say, I want to hear what Tabby has to say about that, actually. So even though I'm supposed to be like the opinion editor, and I literally think about how to convince people day and night, like what language to use, like But people talk a lot about like young people abandoning Israel, but I really feel that Israel abandoned us. It's younger generation going further to the right than the older generation. Netanyahu making common cause with Holocaust deniers and Holocaust revisionists, and like there's really like, why did we abandon them? They have no left. Like there's no left. 6% of Israelis identify as left. Yet we're the ones who say we're abandoning Israel. I just think that language, we really need to like get rid of it already. Like it's the way I see it is it's really the other way around. They're supposed to be the place that's going to rescue us if things go really south here. But a huge portion of American Jews are now no longer considered Jewish by Israeli standards, by the standards of the rabbinate. There's just all these ways in which like the country is really, there's two words for nationalism in Hebrew, le'umiyut and le'umanut. Okay. One of them has really negative connotations, and one of them has really positive connotations. And I really feel that Zionism gave us this, very positive version of nationalism, and that Bibi Netanyahu has really kind of dragged it down until those two things really have no distinction anymore. Like the xenophobia and the ethno-nationalism has really taken over. And so I feel personally extremely betrayed, which puts me in not a good position to be convincing. But also I think to Yair's point, like we don't vote there, like so the question of from a democratic point of view, how much influence we should have, I think as American taxpayers, we have a right to have influence just because of the military aid. But I'm not sure that it's our job to be convincing them how they should be voting. I certainly wouldn't want them to be convincing me how I should be voting. What do you think, Tabby?
I think Israel didn't abandon us. And I think one of the reasons for that is it has too many other things on its hands than to rightly or wrongly so try to focus on how to every day, day in and day out, win the hearts and minds of American Jews. I think Israeli leadership 100%, and especially the Secretary for Diaspora Affairs, recognizes that we're probably the most important diaspora Jewish community in the world, right? American Jews. But, for me, we can't have it both ways. We can't say that on the one hand, Israel can't speak for us and that we should have never outsourced our Jewish identity to it, and then to also come and say that it abandoned us. To say that Israel abandoned us means that we put ourselves in Israel's hands. And if we put ourselves in Israel's hands, then we are acquiescing, to me, in a very beautiful, positive way, that we didn't distinguish ourselves part and parcel from the Jewish state, right? And that we were always together, and hopefully we will be. I think the worst thing that the American Jewish community can do right now is to focus solely on the last year from 2019 to 2020 and possibly another 4 years of a Trump administration, and how this is going to make cataclysmic changes for American Jews and between young Israelis and young Americans. And I'll tell you why. We live in such a volatile, awful, partisan, nasty, pill-popping time that somehow it seems like the administration, however you feel about it, is just going to stay. And in some ways, a lot of the bad policies will have an effect for who knows, God, how many decades to come. But I'm really, truly looking to, let's say even who knows what will happen in the next 5 years. I'm looking to the year 2025. That's where I'm looking at. Because in 2025, Trump will certainly be out of power. And Bibi Netanyahu can't live forever, despite what anybody believes. And so you have another chance for the Israeli public, for the American public, to be able to express themselves democratically in a way that, let me put this to you the right way, that you can't throw back against them, let's say, right? And within that year of 2025, I'm not looking at any domestic policies, and maybe this is a real flaw on my part. What I'm looking at is, will there be another repeat of 600 missiles raining down on Israel, like there was a few weeks ago? It's so sad that every time I wish that young American Jews would start speaking in the positive, about Israel, or thinking about, speaking in a way that wouldn't put young Israelis on the defensive, as you guys are both saying. There's another missile. There's another rocket.
Right.
There's another knife. And now there's another Iran, right? There's more American deployment of warships in the Persian Gulf. And I would say that, if we're going back again, before 2005, everything was so easy. Do you know why it was so easy? Because anybody could walk around college campuses and the halls of Congress and anywhere and say, you have to end the occupation. It's killing us. And then 2005 happened. And Gaza happened. And in 2006, the Hamas elections happened, right? The nightmare of Hamas on Israel's border happened. And now, this is my question, I think, to those for whom rightly and sometimes wrongly, the occupation, especially for the young, is at the forefront of the minds, is how do you, and are you completely ignoring 2005, 2006 in Gaza? So if I'm an Israeli, and like true diaspora Jews, after we escaped Iran, a third of them escaped to Israel, a third of my family escaped to America, and believe it or not, a third of us is still in Tehran. I have very limited communication with them because of what I do. And I speak a lot to my Israeli cousins. They don't like Bibi Netanyahu. But here's the thing, Rob. They served, even my female cousins served in combat, And every time they wish that somebody would talk about them, about my cousins especially, about why they don't like Netanyahu, another rocket comes down, and they're on the defensive all over again. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. I wonder, when we were in Israel most recently and we had just come back from the West Bank, even when you talk to people on the left about your experiences in the West Bank, they get very defensive about the situation. And I just think that goes to this vastly different experience. And I remember Shimon Peres at Rabin's funeral said, we can have two views, we don't have to be two people. But it feels like increasingly Israelis and Americans are becoming two people. I think the other part of it, somebody wrote this in a question, is the religious divide. That, for the Judaism that most American Jews practice is not embraced in Israel. In some cases, it's not legal in Israel. It's not recognized in Israel. And I wonder how you think that contributes to this division. Yair?
So I have actually done some extensive investigative reporting on the inside of the Israeli rabbinate and efforts to reform it or take it over. Maybe one of the longest pieces I ever wrote some years back was an attempt by sort of more progressive Orthodox Jews to take over the Israeli chief rabbinate and make it more responsive to Israel's citizens, instead of doing what it does now, which is dictate who can marry who and who is a Jew, and basically try to mess over as many people as possible who don't fit in with its narrow confines of what Judaism is. So I have good news, and bad news from that story. That the progressive reformers didn't win, but the thing is, the progressive reformers basically, the way they were planning to win the election is they issued an ultimatum to sort of the sanctum that actually chooses the chief rabbis every 10 years, and they said, you elect our people now, right, and we'll fix the rabbinate such that most Israelis will like it, and it will stick around. If you don't, well, we have the votes in the Knesset to privatize every single one of your powers. So right now, all your power comes from the money and other stuff you get from kosher certification, right? And from your power for performing weddings and deciding who can convert and thereby who can be Jewish. We have bills, right, that are in various stages of passage or drafting that we will pass and take all of those away from you and say any rabbi in Israel can basically do that. And that, by the way, means anyone who is basically a rabbi locally, which can end up being, and does end up being in practice, people who are not Orthodox. So these are 10-year periods, and basically they lost that election. So they moved from Plan A, which was take over and fix the rabbinate, to privatize every single power of the rabbinate and hollow it out from within. And that's been going on very efficiently for quite some time.
Did you publish this already?
I wrote an article about, how Israel's chief rabbinate is crumbling a while back, which is sort of just pointing out the three major things that I'm going to talk about, which is, some of you may know that there was actually a court case against an independent kashrut certification authority that now exist in Israel. So if you don't want to use the chief rabbinate to certify your kosher food, which again is their primary source of patronage, you can go to this independent agency, which of course is more modern and has far less restrictive stuff, which is still entirely within Jewish law. It's just not like ridiculously ultra-Orthodox, like beyond what even most Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews say in this country would require. And so this certification agency went around giving out to adults, and everyone understood, right? If it has one of these, I can rely on it, or at least certainly the people who thought that that was okay. So the rabbinate basically took these people to court and said it violates the law. We have a monopoly on kosher certification. And it went all the way up to the Israeli Supreme Court, and the Israeli Supreme Court, in a truly wonderfully Talmudic conclusion, said, yes, it is technically illegal for this group to give out independent kashrut certification. They cannot put up a sign that says this establishment is kosher. What they can do is put up a sign that says this establishment meets the specifications of this particular agency, which effectively means exactly the same thing, and therefore anyone who wants to follow that can follow that, but it won't say it's kosher, right, on the sign, right, but it says effectively the exact same thing. And so basically, that basically took kashrut out of the power of the rabbinate and said other people can set up shop. Naftali Bennett, when he was Minister of Religious Affairs in Israel, because people think of Naftali Bennett, he's very right-wing on nationalism issues, right? Settlement leader, so on and so forth, and wonderfully no longer in the Knesset. But he also is married to a non-Orthodox Jewish woman. And he has no problem with LGBT people. And basically has all these sorts of heresies that don't really fit necessarily into some of the more traditionalist religious camp. And when he was in power on the religious side of things, he acted on those things. And he made it possible for the state, which it still does, to pay reform and conservative clergy in Israel out of the state coffers for the first time. This happened years ago. And the same thing now is true in marriage. You can get married in your local principalities and you no longer have to go to the centralized rabbinate. The same thing is true of conversion. So over time, each of these powers is being taken away from the rabbinate to the point that it becomes a purely ceremonial position, where the basic job of it is either in the best case scenario to say nice things in the wake of tragedy or important Jewish occasions, and in the worst case to say racist or offensive things about non-Jews or about non-Orthodox Jews. But that's basically what it's going to be, and I would tell you this, I will predict this, in like 10 years, that is what the rabbinate will be.
That's a note of hope, and I want you, because we have to wrap up now, to kind of each end on what gives you hope that these bridges, that these divisions could be bridged, that the controversies that exist between American Jews, especially young American Jews in Israel, could be healed to some extent. What one thing gives you hope, and keep it brief, because I'm getting a lot of eyes.
You want to start?
Let's go this way.
Yeah, I
'cause
see you
gotta
passing it back
think.
and forth.
I know. I'm like,
All right. First of all, I know I keep saying this, but again, as an Iranian, and between our coups and revolutions and leadership changes, I'm the biggest proponent of the idea that governments come and go, and the people stay, right? And so no matter how, a young American Reform Jew would feel about being accepted or not by a chief rabbinate or by, the Israeli government, the truth is, if they would sit down to a shakshuka with a young Israeli their age, nobody would probably even ask if it was kosher. They wouldn't, the religiosity wouldn't be on the table, right? They would just, they would just be brethren.
Get people together.
My final thought is this. I think now more than ever, because of the mediums we have at our disposal, the story, the power of the story has never been more sexy and never been more easier to tell in some ways if you educate yourself, and this is the silver lining for it. And whether it's the Jews of color, whether it's, correcting fallacies that a congresswoman makes with real stories and so on. I'm all about the stories and the future of the storytelling as giving young Jews the goosebumps, right? That would bring them back, that would bring them into the fold, and then that would bring them together with the Israelis.
Yeah.
So, we talk a lot about all the tensions surrounding Israel, all of the problems we have, and they're all very, very important. But when I get asked, I'll go and do an Israel 101 lecture on a college campus, and I'll get asked by people, often non-Jews, what do you think is Israel's, most important accomplishment or achievement? And this is what makes me optimistic and just makes me, I think, proud, and I think Jews should be proud of this collectively as an accomplishment, right? The simple fact is that Israel is a success story. Israel, there are millions of people who live full, explicit, open Jewish lives who couldn't have done so if Israel didn't exist, right? So millions of people who were in, repressed or in gulags in Soviet Russia who are now in Israel. and you have millions of Middle Eastern Jews, right, and Jews from North Africa, and you basically, and then, Jews from France who feel that they needed to do this as well.
Right.
And the numbers are staggering, right? It is the single most effective project for rescuing Jews in human history, and it was executed by Jews. And that's the reason why this conversation is important, because that's worth saving, that's worth protecting, right? That's worth building, and that's worth growing. And we shouldn't lose sight of that, and that remains true, right? And that is, like, to me, the guiding star, which is that this is something that, deserves our support and our thought and our attention. So thank you all for coming, and I hope that, we only have so many ideas on this stage, right? But there's so many more people in this room, and so many more people watching, and I hope that, that's the sort of thing that will lead to whatever the next big idea is for the Jews, right? Israel was a big idea, right? There are bigger ideas to come, and I hope to see them myself.
I would say I feel such pride in our community that at a time when we're being literally murdered in our synagogues for who we are not closing in, but opening up and recommitting to the values of tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, like justice, justice you shall pursue. We are recommitting to our coalitions with other faith communities and other racial minorities, and we are recommitting to justice in Israel. I cannot tell you how proud I am of that, because you could so easily see it go the other way, as Tabby was arguing, you see in Israel, where the threat creates this kind of closing in and increased nationalism. And I am just so grateful to belong to a community that has responded to hate and violence against us by opening up and recommitting to the values of justice and equality that are in our Torah.
Thank you. I want to thank you all. It was
Thank
really
you,
wonderful
Rob.
conversation. And I want to introduce Amanda Suskin from the Anti-Defamation League.
Thank you.
Yay, Amanda.
I'm Amanda Suskin. I'm the regional director of the ADL in LA. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Tabby, Yair, Batya, and Rob, for an amazing conversation. Thank you to Rabbi Zweiback and Jeremy Goldstein, Jennifer Smith, and Stacy Rosenthal, and everyone else at Stephen S. Weiss for hosting tonight, and Barry Schwartz, Sierra DeCrosta, Samantha Pohl, Adam Bassiano from IAPF for their partnership, and of course the amazing Sharon Nazarian, Shia Lerner, Ariel Lowenstein, and Natan Packman, and all my ADL colleagues and some of my wonderful ADL lay leaders that are here. Thank you to 30 Years After for sponsoring, and to everyone in the audience for participating. I'm going to sum up what I learned tonight. These are the 3 takeaways. In terms of the divide between the old and the new, the old and the older and younger U.S. Jewish generation, we olders should not underestimate you youngers, right? In terms of the U.S.-Israel divide, U.S. Jews should not tell Israeli Jews that they're drunk and we're taking their keys away. And in terms of the religious divide and the divide between all of our religious strains, shakshuka will fix all of that. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you
Oh,
all.
wait, one more thing. There's if you're one of our young professionals, and we mean by that sort of 30s, 40s-ish, you are welcome to join our special post-event reception and conversation in Zeldin Hershenson Hall, out that way and to the right. And also, please pick up information about ADL or IPF and be involved. Get involved. We need you. Thanks.